to your personalized deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at the political legacy of President Joe Biden as he exits the White House. We got a whole stack of really insightful articles here, and I think you're going to find this one really fascinating.
Yeah, I think this is going to be really thought-provoking. Biden's departure after 5 decades in public service. It really gives us a good chance to look at his impact, not just on recent events, but on how American politics has changed over time as a whole.
So, okay, these articles are painting a picture of what some are calling a mixed bag legacy. On the one hand, Biden got some big wins with legislation, like those massive infrastructure investments. But then on the other hand, there seems to be like a disconnect between those wins and how the public feels.
Yeah, that disconnect is really interesting. We're seeing billions of dollars going into roads, bridges, expanding broadband internet access, all these things that, like, on paper should really help the economy and improve people's lives. But there's still this, like, underlying sense of economic anxiety, this feeling that those wins aren't really making a difference in the lives of everyday Americans.
Yeah, so what's going on there? Why aren't people feeling the positive effects of these policies?
Well, it's complicated. There are a bunch of factors at play. Part of it is definitely the long-term effects of the pandemic, problems with the supply chain and the inflation that hit a lot of household budgets hard. But I think there's also a deeper issue here, this growing distrust in government institutions, a feeling that the political system is rigged against the average person.
So it's like even when positive things are happening, there's this skepticism, this feeling that it's not going to last or that it's not going to benefit them directly.
Right. And this perception is being fed by the very polarized media landscape, Different news outlets are presenting completely different stories about the economy, about Biden's policies, about the overall state of the nation. This creates a situation where people are only consuming information that confirms what they already believe. So it makes it much harder to find common ground or agree on what's actually happening.
It's like everyone's stuck in their own little echo chamber, only hearing what they want to hear. And speaking of echoes, Biden's departure is also being marked by some pretty strained relationships, even within his own party.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Biden is said to have some resentment toward key figures like former President Obama and former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. He feels like they didn't do enough to support him when he was trying to get reelected. It's a really interesting look into how power dynamics work behind the scenes, the kind of tensions that shape political alliances.
Yeah, and then there's that story about Biden naming aircraft carriers after former presidents Bush and Clinton, but not Obama. Some people see that as like a deliberate snub.
It definitely makes you think whether it was intentional or not. It does point to some tension beneath the surface, maybe a feeling of being overlooked or undervalued. And these strained relationships within his own party, they add another layer of complexity to Biden's legacy.
It's like watching a political drama unfold, with all these perceived betrayals and power struggles. And then you add the Hunter Biden controversy to the mix, and it gets even more complicated. The pardon he gave his son on those federal charges has really stirred things up.
To really understand the implications of this pardon, we need to break it down a little. Hunter Biden was facing charges related to tax violations and gun ownership. And for some, especially those who already question the ethics of Hunter Biden's actions, the pardon looks like a blatant disregard for the rule of law.
And the reactions from both sides of the aisle have been strong.
Oh, absolutely. Democrats have expressed disappointment, and some Republicans are even calling for investigations. They see it as a potential cover-up or abuse of power. This issue is tapping into those existing partisan divisions, making people even more distrustful of the Biden administration.
So here we have a president leaving office amidst controversy, facing strained relationships, battling a public perception that doesn't seem to match up with his legislative achievements. The articles even describe the mood in the White House as dejected. They use the word morgue to describe the atmosphere.
It does paint a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it? Biden reportedly feels like his contributions haven't been appreciated, and his aides are bracing themselves for the transition to a new administration under former President Trump.
That's a lot to take in, isn't it? A president leaving office feeling misunderstood, a staff on edge, and a nation struggling with some very complex issues.
It really highlights the complexities and pressures of leadership, the weight of expectations, the challenge of trying to navigate such a deeply divided political landscape. It's easy to get caught up in the policy debates and forget about the human element, the personal toll it takes to be in such a powerful position.
And, speaking of complex situations, there is one development that happened towards the end of Biden's term that offers a glimmer of hope. The Israel-Hamas ceasefire, which his administration helped to secure, it brought an end to a devastating conflict and potentially saved a lot of lives.
It is a significant achievement. It shows that diplomacy can work even in the most difficult situations. The ceasefire came after weeks of intense fighting with heavy casualties on both sides. Biden's administration worked really hard behind the scenes, using diplomatic channels to bring both sides to the negotiating table.
It's a pretty stark contrast to the overall gloomy mood surrounding Biden's exit. And there's an interesting twist to this story. It seems he might have to share credit for this win with Donald Trump.
Yeah, both their teams coordinated on those negotiations that led to the ceasefire. It's an unexpected collaboration in an otherwise very polarized political environment. Makes you wonder, could this kind of cooperation happen more often, even without a major crisis looming?
It's a fascinating question to think about. This situation raises a lot of questions about the nature of diplomacy, the potential for finding common ground, even with strong ideological differences, and maybe the role that shared goals can play in overcoming those divides.
What's really striking is that both Biden and Trump had a clear interest in seeing this conflict resolved. The political pressure was huge, especially with the rising death toll. It suggests that even in the most divisive times, there can be moments where shared interests outweigh partisan differences.
So even though Biden's legacy is marked by controversy and strained relationships, he's leaving office with at least one big diplomatic win under his belt. Even if it's a shared one, what a ride. And it makes you wonder, what are the long-term implications of this collaboration?
It's definitely something to think about. Could this be a model for future cooperation, or was it just a one-time thing? Does the shared success mean that partisan divides are softening, or will it just be a fleeting moment of unity in a political landscape that's still very fractured?
And thinking about Biden's overall legacy, it seems like he's leaving office with a feeling of being misunderstood. His achievements are kind of overshadowed by controversy, and the public's perception of his presidency doesn't seem to line up with his own view of what he accomplished.
That's a really interesting point. Makes you think about how much a leader's self-perception influences their actions and ultimately their legacy. It's a question that goes beyond Biden. It speaks to the very nature of power and ambition. And it leads us to a bigger question for you to consider. How will history ultimately judge Joe Biden's presidency? Will it be his legislative wins, his foreign policy decisions, or the controversies that surrounded his administration?
That's definitely something to chew on. And I think it's a perfect way to transition into the next part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot in this first section. We explored the ups and downs of Biden's mixed bag legacy, his strained relationships, the controversial Hunter Biden pardon, and even that glimmer of hope with the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. But there's still so much more to uncover.
Yeah. In our next segment, we're going to go deeper into the nuances of his presidency. We'll look at his foreign policy record beyond the Israel-Hamas ceasefire and the Afghanistan withdrawal. We'll examine how he handled the pandemic and his attempts to tackle issues like climate change and social justice. We'll look at the challenges he faced, the decisions he made, and the long-term impact those choices will have on American politics and society as a whole.
Sounds like we're in for another fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
So join us for part 2 of our deep dive into the legacy of President Joe Biden. We'll pick up right where we left off, and I think you're going to find it really interesting.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the legacy of President Joe Biden. We've already unpacked quite a bit, exploring both the highs and the lows of his presidency. But I think now's a good time to shift gears and focus on one of the biggest challenges of our time, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to overstate just how much the pandemic impacted every part of life, not just here in the U.S., but across the globe. It must have been incredibly intense for any leader trying to deal with that crisis.
Absolutely. Just imagine stepping into the Oval Office with a rising death toll, a struggling economy, and a deeply divided public wrestling with fear and uncertainty. That was the reality Biden faced when he took office.
So how did he handle such a monumental challenge? What were his strategies to try and get things under control?
Well, initially, his main focus was on containing the virus itself. He brought in mask mandates, increased testing efforts, and pushed for everyone to get vaccinated. He really stressed how important it was to follow public health guidelines.
But we all remember how controversial those measures became, right? There was a lot of pushback, especially from certain groups.
Oh, yeah. It became really tough to balance public health concerns with individual liberties. And that's where those partisan divisions we talked about earlier really came into play. Some people saw the mandates as government overreach of violation of their personal freedoms, while others believed they were absolutely necessary to protect vulnerable populations and prevent the healthcare system from being overwhelmed.
It sounds like Biden was walking a tightrope, trying to keep everyone happy while sticking to his commitment to science and public health.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember that the pandemic also had a devastating impact on the economy. We saw lockdowns, businesses shutting down, supply chain disruptions, millions of people losing their jobs. It was a recipe for economic uncertainty and hardship. And unfortunately, this played a big part in shaping how the public viewed Biden's presidency.
It's that disconnect we mentioned before, right? Even with legislative wins like the infrastructure bill, many Americans were struggling to make ends meet, pay their rent, or keep their businesses running.
Precisely. And it reminds us that even the best intentioned policies can fall short if they don't address the immediate needs and anxieties of the people they're supposed to help.
Okay, so we've talked about the domestic challenges of the pandemic. Now let's switch gears and talk about foreign policy. Biden came in promising to repair America's global image after the turbulent Trump years. How did that actually play out?
He promised to reconnect with allies, rebuild trust, and project an image of strength and stability on the world stage. And one of the most defining events of his presidency in terms of foreign policy was undoubtedly the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, that was a major turning point. How did Biden navigate that crisis?
He really had to tread carefully. He rallied international support for Ukraine, imposed sanctions on Russia, and provided military aid, but he also had to avoid direct conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary.
So lots of high-stakes diplomacy happening behind the scenes. What did the article say about how the world viewed his leadership during this crisis?
Well, they suggest that Biden's handling of the situation earned him some respect on the global stage. He was seen as steady and dependable in a time of great uncertainty. But there were also criticisms, especially from those who felt he wasn't doing enough to stop Russian aggression or support Ukraine more forcefully.
So a mixed bag of reactions, just like we've seen with other parts of his presidency. And we can't forget about the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right. That was a significant setback for Biden, both domestically and internationally.
Those images coming out of Kabul were really tough to watch.
They were. Seeing those desperate Afghans clinging to departing aircraft was deeply disturbing. It was a harsh reminder of the human cost of war and the complexities of leaving a prolonged conflict.
And it really hurt Biden's reputation as a seasoned foreign policy expert, didn't it? It raised questions about his judgment and his ability to anticipate and manage complex crises.
It did. And it fed into a narrative that was starting to gain traction. A narrative of a presidency in decline, struggling to maintain control, both domestically and internationally.
So we're seeing a pretty complicated picture here. A pandemic, a war in Europe, a chaotic exit from a decades-long conflict. Where do we go from here? What other aspects of Biden's presidency should we unpack?
Well, I think it's important to look at how he approached some of the other pressing issues that defined his time in office. Like climate change. Biden entered office promising to make it a top priority. He rejoined the Paris Agreement and pushed for policies to reduce carbon emissions. How effective was he in turning those promises into actual action?
That's a good question. We all know that climate change is one of the most urgent problems humanity faces. So what did Biden actually achieve in that area?
Well, he did secure some legislative wins. Things like investments in renewable energy and incentives for people to buy electric vehicles. But many climate activists felt that these achievements were not enough. They didn't represent the kind of big changes needed to prevent a climate catastrophe.
So we see that gap between ambition and reality again. He sets ambitious goals, but faces pushback from all sides.
Exactly. He faced opposition not only from Republicans, but also from members of his own party, particularly those representing states that rely heavily on fossil fuels. And this internal resistance limited his ability to push through stronger climate policies.
So while he made some progress, it wasn't the game changer many had hoped for. It shows how political realities can limit a leader's ability to make big changes even with the best intentions.
Absolutely. And I think that leads us to another crucial area we need to discuss, Biden's approach to social justice issues. He came into office promising to tackle systemic racism, police brutality, and economic inequality. He even described his presidency as a fight for the soul of America. How did those aspirations turn into concrete actions?
That's a really important question. We saw a lot of social unrest during his time in office, a lot of calls for change. What steps did Biden take to address those concerns?
He made some symbolic moves, like signing executive orders on racial equity, but he struggled to deliver on his bigger promises, like police reform.
Why was that? Was it a lack of political will or something more structural?
It's complicated. Biden faced a divided Congress, a deeply polarized electorate, and a system that's resistant to change. The murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed put enormous pressure on him to tackle police brutality and racial injustice. But efforts to pass legislation failed, highlighting the deep divisions on this issue even within his own party.
It's a reminder that achieving systemic change is really difficult, even with a president who supports the cause. It takes more than just good intentions. It requires sustained political will, a willingness to challenge powerful institutions, and a strong movement demanding change from the ground up.
You're absolutely right. And it also requires a deep understanding of how complex these issues are. There's no single solution that fits every situation. And progress often happens gradually, not overnight.
So it seems like Biden's legacy in this area is a bit unclear. He acknowledged the problems and committed to addressing them, but ultimately his achievements didn't meet the expectations of many who were looking to him for leadership on these issues.
That's a fair assessment. And I
Yeah.
think it emphasizes a point we've been touching on throughout this entire conversation. Judging a presidency is really complex. There's no easy answer to whether a president was successful or not. It depends on the criteria you use, the values you prioritize, and the historical context you're considering.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in the second part of our deep dive. We explored Biden's handling of the pandemic, his foreign policy beyond the highlights, his efforts on climate change, and his approach to social justice issues. It seems like every area we examine reveals a similar pattern. Big ambitions meeting mixed results, a constant struggle to balance competing interests, navigate a divided political landscape, and deliver on promises in the face of immense challenges.
That's a really sharp observation, and I think it sets us up perfectly for the final part of our discussion. In our next segment, we'll zoom out from the individual policies and events and try to grasp the bigger picture. We'll consider the lasting impact of Biden's presidency and tackle the questions that his time in office has left unanswered. Join us for part 3, where we'll try to tie it all together and offer some final thoughts on the legacy of Joe Biden.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the legacy of President Joe Biden. We spent the last 2 parts really digging into the specifics of his presidency. From those initial legislative wins to dealing with the pandemic, the complexities of foreign policy, and that ongoing fight for social justice.
And now as we head into this last part of our conversation, I think it's time to try and piece it all together. Zoom out a little and consider the broader historical context of Biden's time in office.
Okay, so let's take that big picture view.
Yeah.
Then, when historians look back at the Biden presidency, what do you think will be seen as his most lasting legacies?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that'll probably be debated for years to come. But I think some key themes are already starting to emerge. One is just the sheer magnitude of the challenges he faced. Biden walked into office at a moment of serious crisis. The nation was dealing with a deadly pandemic, a super divided electorate, and this real loss of faith in its institutions.
Yeah, he often talked about his presidency as this battle for the soul of America. So do you think he managed to bring back that sense of unity and shared purpose?
It's tough to say for sure. On one hand, he did bring back a sense of normalcy and decorum to the White House after the craziness of the Trump era. His style of governing was more traditional, more focused on finding consensus and compromise, and he did get some pretty big legislative wins, like that infrastructure bill, which could have a lasting positive effect on the American economy.
But those wins haven't always translated into actual improvements in the lives of everyday Americans. And those partisan divisions we talked about, they don't seem to have gone away.
Right, and that points to a bigger trend in American politics, this kind of erosion of shared values, the increasing difficulty of finding common ground, especially with the media landscape being so fragmented. Everyone's constantly being bombarded with information that just confirms what they already believe. It's a problem that goes way beyond any single president.
So it's not just about passing laws or signing orders. It's about rebuilding trust, bridging those divides,
Yeah.
and finding ways to address the anxieties and grievances that are driving this polarization.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important aspect of Biden's legacy, his attempt to repair America's global image after the America First approach of the Trump years. He promised to re-engage with allies, rebuild trust, and project an image of strength and stability on the world stage.
And how did that go? I mean, we saw both successes and failures.
Yeah, definitely. That chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan was a big hit to his reputation, both here and abroad. It made people question his judgment, his competence, his ability to handle those really complex situations.
But he did manage to rally international support for Ukraine against Russian aggression, which showed he could lead on the world stage.
True. And he also re-engaged with allies on climate change. He rejoined the Paris Agreement and pushed for a more unified approach to tackling this global challenge. So like with many other aspects of his presidency, it's kind of a mixed bag.
It seems like mixed bag is the perfect way to sum up the Biden presidency. He had these big, ambitious goals, but often got stuck dealing with the realities of politics, both at home and abroad.
And that's what makes studying history so interesting. It's not just about dates and events. It's about understanding all the factors that shape a leader's choices. the unexpected consequences of their actions, and the impact they have on the world.
And in the end, it's up to each person to decide how they'll remember the Biden presidency, what lessons they take from it, what questions they keep thinking about.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great note to wrap up on. We've covered a lot of ground, explored some really complex issues, and I hope this deep dive is giving you, our listener, a better understanding of the Biden presidency and the challenges of leadership in our time.
It's definitely been a fascinating journey for me. I want to thank you, our expert, for sharing your incredible insights. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you'll keep exploring these ideas, seeking out different perspectives, and forming your own opinions about the legacy of President Joe Biden. Until next time, keep those minds engaged.